Afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at the Thomas Balch Library for our virtual presentation with Andrew Jampoler on the slave trade at sea. We are so excited to have Andrew with us again for a wonderful presentation. If you have any questions for Mr. Jampoler, please put them in the chat box or the Q&A box. We will get to them at the end of the presentation. If you're having any technical difficulties during the presentation, please email us at balchlib, BALCHLIB @leesburgva.gov, and I'll put that in the chat as well, or give us a call at 703-737-7195, and we'd be happy to give you a hand with those technical problems. You will not have any video or audio during this presentation. You'll only be able to hear us and see us. So if you're not getting your video to work or audio to work in terms of being able to see yourself or hear yourself, you shouldn't. But if for some reason you can't see us or hear us, please reach out to us so that we can assist you with that. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Mr. Jampoler so he can begin the presentation.
Good afternoon and thank you. And welcome to the Winter-Spring lecture series at the Balch Library. There will be 3 lectures in this series. The first today on the slave trade at sea. The second about Henry Morton Stanley, Through the Dark Continent. You'll recall Stanley was the explorer who, thanks to James Gordon Bennett's publicity search, was sent to Africa looking for Dr. Livingstone, I presume. Fascinating story about a man whose nickname was Bula Matari, the Breaker of Rocks, a rugged explorer and an Africa hand who has been a model for others since. The last talk in this series will be Congo. It's drawn from a book of mine about the expeditions of Lieutenant Emery Taunt up the Congo River in 1885. At first, as a naval officer, he returned as the first American diplomat resident in the Congo and died there miserably a few months later. And the story that I'll tell you is the story about the United States, the Congo in the 1880s and later, and Emery Taunt, who died there. So thank you for joining us. Let's begin today with the slave trade at sea. And we'll start with this image. It is the statue of Teddy Roosevelt that up until a few days ago stood proudly for decades in front of the American Museum of Natural History in Manhattan. Teddy Roosevelt, his dates are there, 1858 to 1919, was many things: a cowboy, a wrangler, an army officer, a police commissioner, the vice president, the president, secretary of the Navy before that. And he was, for many people, sort of the model American: bold, dashing, active, eager, courageous, and articulate. He wrote a very well-regarded history of the Spanish-American War. This statue by James Fraser stood since 1940, in front of the Museum of Natural History in Manhattan. And Teddy is there, proudly astride a horse. To one side is an American Indian, a Native American. To another side is a black man. And as the decades have rolled on, this year, the decision was made to remove this statue. It was too obviously caught up in the modern times in the sense of racial discrimination and class distinctions, and it was felt to be inappropriate in front of the museum. It has been relocated. It will be relocated. It hasn't been relocated yet. This is a picture of that relocation going on a few days ago to the Teddy Roosevelt National Park in Medora, North Dakota, a national park and presidential library that is only now being built, and where they have eagerly accepted the same statue that I think New York sensitivities required its removal. This is a fraught subject that you and I are addressing today. The business of of slavery in the world and in the Americas, and specifically in the United States. There are a number of excellent books on the subject, and I will be passing through showing you some of them very quickly. All these books are listed on my website, which is, of course, a cunning way I have of luring you to that site. But these are the books I would recommend to you on the subject of slavery recently. We'll be adding some to that from the Wall Street Journal of a few years ago in a column by Andrew Del Banco. But these books and earlier volumes, the ones I first showed you are fairly recent, are the best that I've found on the subject of slavery in the world, in the Americas, and in the United States. And I urge you to consider reading one or another of those. The most famous book on this subject, I think, is Alex Haley's Roots. It came out first in 1976. It has been republished many times since. It's sold literally by the millions, many awards. It sort of riveted America's attention to the whole business of slavery and to Americans whose roots literally were in Africa. It subsequently became a great television series. You see it there, advertisement for it in the bottom right, and a movie as well. What Haley did was he traced his origins back to a man called Kunta Kinte, who was, he believed, living on Fort James Island in the Gambia. That island first became a British fort and slave station, and later on it was adapted to other uses. There's an illustration of it up there, and an illustration in the bottom left of the fort on St. James's Island in the Gambia. It was about, I think, 20 miles up from the mouth of the Gambia River. This is a photograph of that island, St. James's Island, and the fort on it that my wife Susie and I took when we were there. An illustration on the left shows you the fortress, and that was a holding pen for slaves for a period of time, and we'll talk more about these pens, these castles, in a little bit. Books have had an enormous effect in shaping our thinking about slavery, its history, its vices, its conditions, but so also have movies. These are posters from several of them. Spielberg's film Amistad there on the left, the recent, much more recent Academy Award-winning film 12 Years a Slave, photograph in the bottom right is from that movie. And there's The Birth of a Nation is another one. You should not be thinking in terms of slavery as an exclusive condition of black men and women. The Other Slavery by Andreas Resendez talks about slavery of Native Americans, of American Indians. That's what the illustration on the left is. And this is another dimension of slavery in the New World: the seizure, the capture, the effective enslavement of Indian tribes, American Indians in both continents. That was less conspicuous and perhaps unfairly less notorious than the slavery we're more familiar with, in part because Native Americans proved to be very susceptible to the diseases of the Old World, and consequently the numbers, the rate of growth, their presence was never as visible, never as commanding as was that of black Africans. In the top right is a book by Sherman Alexie. He is himself a Native American National Book Award winner, a series of short stories about life on the reservation. The stories are enormously readable, and if you're interested in reading something by a Native American, I recommend that to you, subject to the caveat that he turns out to have a very unpleasant personal life. An endorsement of his book is by no means an endorsement of him. This goes on further to the enslavement of Native Americans. It's some illustrations that show you those conditions. These poor people were put into horrific labor in the mines and fields of the Americas, and these illustrations will show you that. There was a recognition among certain men of the church that fundamentally the enslavement and abuse of Native Americans was profoundly anti-Christian. There is a picture of one of the friars who led that resistance. But really what controlled the extent of Native American slavery was the diseases and the relatively small population against the enormous population that could be drawn from Africa. So let's turn our attention to the slave trade, the African slave trade. The painting here is by Baird. It appears at the Bridgman Library, and it's a good summary in art of what we'll be talking about today. There on the right is the ship owner and slave keeper resting himself, and I suspect thinking of his profits. There on the left, there's some slaves being lashed aboard a ship. In the middle are more slavers and more victims. A victim, obviously, dying there in the center of the painting, a black woman looking like she is mournfully contemplating what her future is. And this is the trade that we'll be talking about today. I appreciate this as an enormously sensitive subject, especially perhaps for Virginians, and I'm not unaware of that. I will say possibly some provocative things. I ask you to consider them, and I'll be happy to talk to you at the end of the presentation about that. For an overview of the Atlantic slave trade, I can show you this map. It'll give you a sense of the flow of the millions, and we're talking about something over 12 million altogether. 12 million Africans brought from one or another of these places on essentially on the west coast of Africa. You see the sites there, and carried to the New World, and in very small numbers elsewhere. For some went to the Cape of African Cape, for instance, and other places, but carried to the New World to labor, to live, and to die there. The charts I'll show you will be from the book from the Yale University Press, published in 2010. I think this represents still the authoritative census, so to speak, of the origins of slaves, of the routes they took in the New World. And I would point out to you of the 12 million and a half, say, who we believe were transported, only 10 million, a little under 11 million, survived the passage in those ships to be delivered to some port in the New World, to live there, labor there, and to die there. By year, this timeline, also drawn from that same source, shows you in hundreds of thousands or in thousands the numbers taken across from the 16th century to the end of the 19th, and you'll get a sense of the movement, the flow, and then there's some time ticks there that show you some features, historical features of that same progression. Let's begin with transportation, understanding at the outset that slaves, prospective slaves, were captured in Africa. They were either captured by white men, by black men who were chieftains of their tribe or with whom they were at war, or for other reasons, delivered to holding ports, to castles on the African coast, loaded aboard ship, and shipped across the Atlantic, North Atlantic or the South Atlantic, to labor and to die. The illustration here is a representative illustration of packing a slave ship with the bodies of these poor people. And packing is the operative word. The crowding was enormous, impossible living conditions, very little room, very little food, very little water, and rampant disease. The photograph on the top left will give you a sense of that somehow also. This is the loading diagram I'm showing you comes from 1823. It was from a French slaver moving between Africa and the New World. Embarkation, slaves in chains, brought from the holding pens of Africa in great crowds. This is a handsome painting by an artist from Benin, and it hangs in one of the collections that we've seen. It gives you a feel for the procession of these poor suffering people from shore to ship to begin their passage. Crossings is a book on the Atlantic slave trade by James Walvin. The cover illustration is one that I'm showing you here enlarged. The illustration is by a British sailor, a British naval officer who served aboard HMS Albatross, and he drew this illustration. It hangs in the National Maritime Museum. It'll give you another feel of the crowding and the conditions aboard these ocean transports. Photographs can reinforce that. As you might suspect, the suffering on this transit was great. So also was the dying. The survival rates, well, I say 1.5 million people died in the course of this process over that century or so. J.M.W. Turner painted this painting that hangs in front of you. It's in the collection in Boston of the Zong, the slave ship that on the 29th of November, 1781, becalmed in the doldrums of the Atlantic, in that central Atlantic area where the winds seem to die off and sailing ships float and drift rather than sail. Becalmed in the doldrums, the captain of the Zong decided he would throw overboard some 130 slaves of his cargo to save water for the crew and the rest of the slaves that he was carrying. And this painting marks that horrific event, and the book by James Walvin describes it as well. Conditions were so oppressive, it should not surprise you that there were mutinies on board, or insurrections rather. It wasn't the crew mutinying, it was the slaves rising in an effort to relieve themselves. This is a painting of an insurrection on board a slave ship in 1851. You'll notice on the right, on the quarterdeck, the crew has retired with guns, and they are fighting and firing on the rebelling slaves midships and forward. The balance of power in such situations was very uneven. Insurrections, uprisings of this nature were very infrequent and almost never successful. I know of one, and you perhaps know of Amistad as well, but by and large, the slaves loaded aboard in Africa were shipped to the New World, and they either arrived in the New World or they died en route. This is an illustration from that same geography of the Middle Passage on the right. It shows you some indication of who was carrying these people, Portuguese, British, French, and others, and the direction of the flow. Notice that the delivery of slaves to the United States was relatively small numbers in terms of the total movement of slaves from west to east across the Atlantic. We'll talk a little bit more, or maybe a lot more about that here soon. A further illustration now of the flow into South America, and a period illustration from that period showing slaves at work in the fields and in the mines of the New World. The graph, the map that you see showing the movement from Africa to South America is effective for the period 1561, 1858. Speaking of the nationalities of those running the slave transit operation, the Portuguese across 340 years, that began very early in 1526, carried something just under half of the total, which is over 5 million captives, and they were delivered almost exclusively to South America, to the eastern coast of South America. The British, up until the trade was terminated, carried some 2 million, almost 3 million captives, and you'll see those went into the Caribbean and significantly into Jamaica, the sugarcane fields of Jamaica. This was an enormous source of revenue for the British. We'll talk about sugar in a minute. The result was an enormous population of slaves working the very many sugar plantations on the island, fed for the most part by dried cod from Canada and forced to labor in the sugarcane fields uh, of, uh, of Jamaica, a source of fabulous wealth for the British Empire while it went on. The French, too, hauled across slaves to their colonies in the New World. The estimates are about 1,400,000 were carried in French bottoms and French ships. Another look at the statistics. The slaves imported into North America, the total 12.5 million, into America, the total something under 500,000, and the time periods in both cases of this movement. And you see that they peak around the turn of the century, around 1800. Once delivered in the United States, they were moved from ports. The ports are there, obviously, on the waterfront. Wilmington, Charleston, Savannah are those that are identified. Across country to the various plantations of the South. The reason the South was the nexus of American slavery was because of its plantation economy. The land in the South was suitable for large farms where it was not in New England. Uh, there you had the rocks and very difficult land to farm, and consequently, it was much less hospitable to the idea of slavery and to slave labor, which was essential in a pre-industrial time in the vast farms, the vast plantations of the American South. The process began, the business of slavery began at the West African coast, where slaves were brought from the interior for a variety of sources, from a variety of sources and for a variety of reasons, to castles or to prisons, to holding tanks in the ports that are identified here, from Senegambia south to several in West Central Africa. The size of those circles, it gives you a feel for the numbers that move through those ports. The largest of the circles is about 5 million. Here's a closer look at the northernmost areas, the Senegal River, Dakar, Gorée Island. We talked already about James's Island there in the Gambia River. Essentially, slaves brought to the coast and held there until slavers appeared to take their captives on board and to carry them across. And these holding facilities were very substantial. They were fortifications, both to serve as jails, but also to serve as fortifications to control the surrounding countryside and to give a base for the Europeans who were stationed there, living there, and working there. This is a picture of the holding facilities on Gorée Island on the right. Prisons is what they amounted to. That middle crowd is a group of tourists, among which my wife and I numbered, as we looked at Gorée Island's House of Slaves. Enormously depressing a sight. The most famous ones were those on the Bight of Africa, perhaps. Elmina Castle, there on the top left, Fort Christianborg Castle, and then the Cape Coast Castle. Cape Coast is probably the most famous of them because we had a presidential visit there, well, now decades ago. A book on this subject by William St. Clair, The Door of No Return, talks a little bit about one of these facilities. Another look at them, again, Cape Coast Castle, Elmina, there they stand. The maps to either side are period maps, and these are, with the exception of the photograph, period illustrations of these fortress prisons that were the first stop on the shipment of slaves across Cape Coast Castle. Here, the famous Door of No Return at Cape Coast Castle, where the slaves left the castle and loaded aboard ships, is there in that bottom center picture. These were truly fortifications. The cannon on the bottom right show you that they were designed to sustain themselves in the face of European assault or native pressures, although those guns, of course, are all facing to sea, and that tells you who they were protecting against. Fort Christiansborg, another of them. The painting there is around 1800. It shows two British slavers, vessels who have arrived at Christiansborg to collect slaves and to take them across the Atlantic. A period map of the same reason is shown here. This is Cape Coast Castle again, and the caption is the principal fort and factory belonging to the English African Company. Down in there's a caption for Elmina, the principal fort belonging to the Dutch company, and another top right, an English fort again. The infrastructure for moving people off of Africa and into the New World was well developed, well supported, and impenetrable. These were powerful fortresses. Some other sites on the Congo and Luanda and Benguela. I'll show you a really moving monument in Benguela here in just a moment. But up and down the coast were these holding pens. Here in Luanda, the little peninsula up just south of the Congo, another illustration of that. And finally, the monument to slavery, to the suffering of slaves in Benguela. That monument stands there today, enormously touching, gives you a sense of the horrors of the trade. Why slavery? Why was this the first really big international business? It was because slavery provided labor in an era before industrialization, where manual labor was the only way to extract resources, to extract riches, to manufacture products, to have agricultural plantations big enough to produce yields for export. The drivers in this were silver and gold mines, sugar plantations, cotton plantations, rice plantations, tobacco plantations, and very finally at the end, even industrialization, because early industrialization required access to enormous pools of labor. This is the Potosi mine in what is today Bolivia. It is a picture of the mountain that produced an enormous amount of silver and gold. So much so that exported to Spain, as it was early in the period, it created a horrific inflation in Spain that upset the Spanish economy substantially. There was so much gold flowing out of this mine, all thanks to the labor of subterranean slaves. The mine was established in 1546, as you see, and continued on for decades. This is a illustration of slaves from Guinea digging for gold for the Spanish and dropping the extracted ore on the ground to be further refined. Sugar had its origins in Asia, and across the centuries, sugar cane as a farm product moved slowly across Southwest Asia through the Mediterranean and out into the Atlantic, where plantations were established finally in Madeira and the Canary Islands by the Portuguese. The map shows you the movement of sugar cane and sugar cultivation from its home ground, so to speak, across to the Atlantic. And ultimately, of course, if you look at that small map on the bottom, you'll see that it migrates from there over to the New World, where it becomes a principal crop, an enormously popular consumer item in Europe and other places. The plantations required a phenomenal amount of labor. That labor was almost invariably black Africans. The illustration on the left shows the process of cutting cane, and it gives you a sense of the size of the plantations and necessarily the amount of labor required. The illustration on the right is a sugar house where they're boiling to extract the sweetener from the cane itself. Heroic amount of labor and a fabulously wealthy product. Much of Britain's success, economic success in the colonial era, had to do with the export of sugar from Jamaica, where a few thousand, relatively few thousand planters were supported by many tens of thousands of agricultural slaves on the plantations. These cartoons are a little bit different. They relate sugar to the economy in Britain. The cartoon on the left says, the gradual abolition of the slave trade, or the leaving of sugar by degrees. And on the right, it is the king, the queen, and several princesses, and the king is explaining how they're giving up sugar, and tea tastes just as good without it, or better than it did with it. And these are economic arguments associated with the end of slavery, the end of transportation of slaves initially, that were argued in Great Britain. A second commodity, and you know this already, a second commodity that was possible only through the labor of countless numbers of slaves, was cotton. The book by Beckert, Empire of Cotton, is a great introduction to that whole business where cotton was king. It ran the mills of Europe, South American cotton, ran the cotton mills of Europe, and the great industry that grew from the manufacture of cloth out of cotton. You get some sense of the plantations in the United States, in the Americas, from this illustration of a cotton plantation in Mississippi, and from the photograph there showing cotton being picked, collected, cleaned, and getting ready for processing. The interior of a boiling house, a cotton boiling house there, and a mill there. Another agricultural product was rice, another agricultural product made possible only by the enormous amount of slaves laboring in the plantations, largely in the Carolinas. A book called Black Rice describes the African origins of cultivation of rice in the Americas. African rice was black with a hardy husk. Its cultivation, its processing was brought to the Americas by slaves themselves from what is called the Rice Coast. You see the origins there of that flow of captives from the Rice Coast. It was processed very differently than what's much more familiar to us, the Oriental white rice that we use today. But in both cases, it required an enormous amount of labor in flat wetlands, and this labor was provided by slaves. Some illustrations of that here. It's a plantation, rice plantation near Savannah, Georgia, and the processes of threshing and operating and planting and harvesting are all illustrated there. Another plantation product, this one familiar to Virginians, of course, is tobacco, and these illustrations show the place of slaves in the cultivation of tobacco and in the collection of the leaf. And finally, and briefly, the labor represented by slaves was important even in the early ages, in the early age of industrialization, because many of those new machines required manpower to operate, to crank, to pedal, and to move product from place to place. So the introductions, the slow introductions of industrialization did not terminate the desire, the requirement for labor as represented by slaves. Here's a machine works illustration that also still had significant slave labor presence in it. Arriving in the New World, the slaves were subject to one of history's great horrors, one of history's great indignities. That was the open market slave trade. This is an illustration of an auction of slaves in the open market. Here in Charleston, at the Charleston Piers, an advertisement showing the sale of 250 fine, healthy Negroes just arrived from the Windward and Rice coasts. Care has been taken to keep them free of the least danger of being infected with smallpox. So, and there's a note there for your reassurance, fully half of them have already had smallpox in their own country. The horrors of slavery began to percolate in Europe and in the Americas in the 18th century as people studied what they were doing to other people in the fields, the farms, and the factories of the New World. One of the great reformers was William Wilberforce of Britain. There's a painting of him by Lawrence. He and others understood what that caption on the painting to the left shows. Am I not a man and a brother? They understood the fundamental obscenity represented by slavery. And the process began in the 18th century in Europe and in England and other places to outlaw slavery. It was a very slow process, and it moved in stages. The first stage was the outlawing of the transportation of new slaves to the Americas. The second and final stage was outlawing the ownership of slaves. And both of those were long and drawn out with their origin in the first stage and an important role played by the reformer Wilberforce. There was ultimately a decision on a first ban on slave transportation. In the United States, the ban was effective in 1807. The last legal transport in the United States was the slaver Venus, arriving in December 1807. That prohibition stepped through in stages, and it's interesting to begin with the Constitution in 1788. The U.S. Constitution reflecting the interests of Southern plantation owners and Southern wealth in general, that the migration and importation of slaves shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to 1808. And this was a negotiated time as part of the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. So also was there a negotiation that permitted slaves to be counted as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of a census for the House of Representatives. These were concessions reflecting the politics of the period between what were then colonies and what soon would become states. In 1794, there was an act passed to prohibit the American traffic in slaves to a foreign country. And finally, in 1807, there was a prohibition that it was no longer lawful to import slaves to the United States. It was lawful to own them, to own their increase, their children, but no longer could new slaves be brought. And this was the first, here in the United States and elsewhere, the first kind of control, the notion that you could keep what you had, but you could not increase it other than by natural increase. While there were laws, while there was a prohibition in the United States against the importation of slaves, it continued for another 50 years. The last transport of slaves that we know of into the United States was the ship Clotilda. She arrived in the 1860s. The last transport that we know of carrying these unfortunate people. The owner there, Timothy Mayer, William Foster, or her captain, and the builder of the ship. Her arrival has been memorialized in a number of ways. There's a book called A Barracoon. You see it there on your left by Hurston. There's other memorials to Clotilda, Dreams of Africa and Alabama. And there is the cemetery for those first arrivals in the Africatown graveyard there. I would invite your attention to that book because it'll give you a sense of sort of the death of the importation of new slaves. Here's some summary illustrations showing the movement of slaves before the abolitionist era, before the prohibitions, and the very sharp reduction of the movements afterwards. While transportation of slaves was still legal, there was an effort by the Royal Navy, a serious effort by the Royal Navy, a somewhat less serious effort by the U.S. Navy to control, to prohibit, to interdict the movement of slaves across the Atlantic. There's some books here that talk about that subject. Incidentally, recall that these books are on the website. You don't need to be scribbling down furiously. There's also an article I wrote in the Naval History magazine that you see there several years ago on the U.S. Navy's anti-slavery patrol. That anti-slavery patrol on the part of the U.S. Navy was not especially effective for many reasons. Not many ships were committed to it. Most Navy secretaries were Southerners in that period, and I think that had something to do with the lack of enthusiasm for prosecuting this particular mission. It was also a difficult mission to do. The U.S. Navy's base was on Cape Verde for it, covering a vast amount of water along a very, very unhealthy coast. The Royal Navy had a much broader interdiction effort. You see there in red an illustration of where they operated from. And there were some substantial successes. The U.S. Navy's West Africa Squadron had some successes in that interdiction mission. USS Shark was one of the, an Alligator were two of the vessels involved in those patrols. And you can see here ships seized by the British in the various stations that they had, significant numbers. Towards the very end and after the end of legal movement, those numbers are in the approaching 70, 60, 70, 80 ships at a time. Very significant given the very small force on station for the purposes of the interdiction of slavery. Handsome painting by Huggins, it hangs in the Royal Maritime Museum, of the slaver Formidable there in the middle being shot to pieces by HMS Buzzard as one of the successes of the interdiction effort. The horrific illustration on the left is a drawing of slaves saved, rescued by HMS Undine as part of this interdiction effort. It was published in the Graphic in 1884. And you see that slaves liberated from slave ships, there is a chart that illustrates their return home or return to Africa. I'm not certain where they went from the port, their return, and the successes of the interdiction effort. Here in the United States, I think one of the powerful forces that turned American attention, north and south, to the horrors of slavery was Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was published in 1852. And the illustration, incidentally, is from an article about it in the New Yorker magazine. It was published in 1852 and brought out the horrors of slavery, of life among the lowly, in a way that gripped and captured the imagination of many Northerners and perhaps even a few Southerners. It was an important vehicle for mobilizing anti-slavery sentiment where slaves were already not permitted. And now we get to the part of the conversation that is a complicated one, and especially for audiences in Virginia and places south. It is absolutely clear to me what the causes, what the purposes of the American Civil War were. It is clear to me because I have read the documents, the resolutions of the state legislatures of the states of the South, the states of the Confederacy, who felt obliged to explain their purposes in secession. This is a sample of one. It's South Carolina. It's a declaration of the immediate causes which induce and justify the secession of South Carolina from the federal union. It was published at the conclusion of a meeting of the South Carolina legislature. And the issue for these legislators was the preservation of the institution of slavery. They don't talk about states' rights, which is the alternative explanation for the impetus behind the American Civil War. It is the preservation of slavery. This is true of the legislators from all the states that became the Confederacy, what their explanations for their actions were. They explain themselves in just the same way the American colonists in the Declaration of Independence had explained why they were withdrawing Great Britain. The Civil War was a war about slavery, the preservation of it on the one hand, the elimination of it on the other hand. That war began with the assault on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, and you'll see in this really handsome 1861 map that's held at the Library of Congress how Fort Sumter sits at the throat of Charleston Harbor, this enormously important southern port. And it was held by the Union Navy, by the Navy at the time, and it came under assault by the port batteries, and it fell as the first act of the Civil War that followed. Years later, Fort Sumter was again the focus, the focal point of the war, only this time of the war's conclusion, as the flag of the Union was raised on the same flagpole where it had been torn down years before. Henry Ward Beecher lectured, some thought endlessly, at the ceremony marking the raising of the flag and the end of the war. Well, before we stop talking and let you start talking, I'm not so naive as to believe that the Civil War ended slavery, ended racism, ended slavery in the world, ended racism in the United States. We are groping through right now a very difficult period, trying to realign our values with our practices, and that awkward mismatch where we are falling far short of how we should be treating each other. I believe confidently that as each year goes by, we are better at implementing the promises that our proud founding documents make about the equality of mankind and how people should be treated and how they should be governed. But we still have a way to go, and the removal of the Teddy Roosevelt statue, which stands in New York, which stood in New York handsomely for decades, but is now something of an embarrassment, just as statues of Columbus and others are something of embarrassments as we begin to rethink the relationships that we have among the peoples of this country and the citizens of our nation. So I thank you for having listened to me. Our next talk will be Through the Dark Continent, Henry Morton Stanley and the Exploration of Africa. And before I turn this loose to questions, I will mention to you that Stanley's expedition was a publicity stunt initially. James Gordon Bennett of the New York Herald launched Stanley in the hunt for Dr. Livingston, I presume, as a publicity exercise. It was brilliantly successful, but it turns out that Stanley was a brilliant explorer and a powerful figure in his own right. Bennett, who reveled in the publicity his paper had gotten, went on to do something quite similar. He launched a U.S. Navy expedition through the Bering and around the Arctic Sea in USS Jeannette, which turned out to be a catastrophe and much less good publicity than he'd gotten from the Stanley expedition. That said, I'm happy to have been able to talk to you, and I look forward to talking to you about or responding to your questions and comments for the next few minutes. Or if you'd like to reach out to me through our website, please feel free to do that. Over to you folks at Balch, and with my thanks also for your patience in setting this up. Questions?
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box or the Q&A box, and we will get through as many as we can. So one of the questions was if you could discuss a little bit more about the move from indentured workers to enslaved, the economic drives behind that.
These were parallel processes, I think. Indentured, for those of you for whom that word is unfamiliar, it was essentially a laborer who came to the United States under contract to perform labor for a defined period of time. 7 years, as I recall, was often the term, at the conclusion of which his employer, unpaid labor incidentally, at the conclusion of which his employer would release him from his contract and provide him with certain necessities of life and labor, some tools, some other things that would convert this contract laborer into a completely free citizen and to provide him with the beginnings of what he needed to start life anew in the new world. Fundamentally different from slavery, where the ownership was first not of a man's labor, but of him or her. And second, where there was no period involved, it was a lifelong condition for the slave and for his or her offspring as well. So two different ways of dealing with the problem of getting labor where you needed it. Indenture was workable only in, relatively speaking, small numbers because there were, relatively speaking, few people who wanted to travel to the New World under those conditions. Slavery, of course, was involuntary, and huge numbers, millions, as I've showed you, were involved in that. Okay.
I have to unmute myself. Another question that came in was on the first anti-slavery movement slide. You had a mention of Josiah Wedgwood. What was his connection to the anti-slavery movement? Could you discuss that a little bit?
Wedgwood was intellectually and emotionally committed to the end of the movement. He worked publicly to support those, and he also did some illustrations that showed almost in a different medium, almost like cartoons, that showed the freedom, the manumission of slaves, and he was on the side of the political forces uh, in England, in the UK, that were agitating aggressively for the end of the transportation of slaves.
Have you researched the sources of slaves from the viewpoint of African tribal leaders? And if you have, can you talk a little bit about that? If you haven't, can you refer people to maybe some sources on that?
I I have not, although I will tell you that one of the sources of African slaves were the conflicts among tribal leaders. Uh, Africans warred among themselves just as Europeans did, as Asians did, and consequently, some of the slaves delivered to the European forts were prisoners of war of African kings who had fought their tribe against someone else's tribe and defeated it. This is often used as an argument that says, well, slavery couldn't have been so bad. The Africans were doing it to themselves after all. Uh, I leave it to you to decide if that's an argument that is sustainable. But in fact, some of the slaves were prisoners of war in tribal conflicts that had been delivered and sold by their chiefs, by the chief, uh, to the Europeans, moving them across. Um, I mentioned to you that some of the books I referred to are not complete in the sense that we have some others, and there are some on the list of titles that I'll be adding that'll address this a little more completely. That's about what I have to say for it right now.
You first of all included some wonderful maps and graphics that kind of gave an idea of numbers and things like that. I think the atlas that you referenced is an incredibly good source for people that are interested in some of the more numerical statistical aspects of this topic. But one of the questions that we did get in was about the discussion of maybe the breakdown of the age of people that were brought over in the slave trade and the gender makeup. Was there um, an age group that was more likely to be brought over as part of the slave trade? Did they gear more towards men than women? A younger group, did they avoid children and the elderly? Or did they bring over whomever they could capture?
One way to view slavery, and I've suggested it to you, is an economic system. And obviously, youthful, vigorous males were the desirable product that was on for sale. At the same time, women of childbearing age were important too, both for the fact of childbearing and also for licentious reasons as well. Children, much less so, for obvious reasons also, but very quickly, the natural increase in slave colonies and slave camps would result in small and increasingly larger numbers of children. The population was skewed just as you would expect it to be. The population in transport was skewed towards men who were of working age and apparently healthy. And health was an important issue. There's some paintings and discussions of really horrible, invasive inspections of slaves to ensure their health, to ensure their vigor, to ensure that they're not carrying any, the phrase was dread tropical diseases, because the impetus behind this all was economic.
Gave a estimated idea, and obviously it's very difficult to get a number for this, but can you give an idea of about how many lives were lost during the slave trade?
About well, the numbers that I've seen in that manual, not manual, excuse me, atlas, is something well over 1.5 million. In the trade, meaning in the transportation process. Uh, I cannot give you a feeling for what the mortality statistics were like in the colonies, in the camps, on the fields and the farms. Uh, I don't know that those data exist. I suspect they do, but I'm unfamiliar with them. In any case, the atlas that I've showed you suggests that what 15-20% of those transported died in the process.
And I'd just like to emphasize again that the books and resources that Mr. Jampoler has mentioned in his presentation and are available on his website and that he said he will be adding to are great resources if you'd like further information on a specific topic, or you're just looking for some general information. Those resources are definitely good ones to look at. That is going to be it for us today. We do need to wrap it up. I would like to thank all of you for attending and Mr. Jampoler for another wonderful and very informative presentation. We did record this presentation, so if you'd like to view it again, we will have it available. It does take a few days to process, but we will be getting that for you in the next few days. We'll be sending out links to everyone who registered, and it will be available on our social media. Thank you again for attending. Thank you, Andrew Jampoler, for this presentation, and we hope all of you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, and join us in the middle of March for the next talk.
Absolutely. Have a great day, everyone.